Right, tonight, chapter 5, Chapter 5. Uh, so we're up to chapter 5 of the footsteps of the Messiah, and chapter 5 should be a fairly short one tonight, because we're only going to cover four things in this chapter. Sorry, only three, because the fourth one we'll cover in the next chapter, in chapter 6. But we'll be going over what this chapter calls the other pre-tribulation events. So the last chapter that we deal with was chapter 4, and that covered pre-tribulation events, before tribulation, and those events, or all 9 of them, followed a particular sequence or a chronological order. So those are the ones that really that the Bible are clear about in terms of the sequential order that they come in terms of Bible prophecy. And those are the ones we covered in the last chapter. But the ones that we're touching here in chapter 5 is other pre-tribulation events that we don't have a clear information from the scriptures in terms of where they fall in a particular sequence. And so the main thing is they will happen before the tribulation, and we're going to just touch on those tonight, But if you have your Bibles there with you, let's turn to some scriptures tonight, But let us not delay. So here we go. Other pre-tribulation events. So tonight we're going to cover, of course, there are four other pre-tribulation events, but tonight we're going to cover the first 3 there. So the first one we'll cover tonight is a blackout event, and then we'll also cover the Elijah event, and also again we'll touch on again. I know this has been mentioned before in terms of Third Temple, but that's also another event that we will touch on as well tonight. And then of course there's the rapture, but the rapture will be covered a lot more in detail in verse 6. So hopefully we won't all be raptured before that chapter, but until next Wednesday we'll see what the scriptures tell us in regards to their rapture, But anyway, hi AJ, hi Sina, hi Nera. And so that's what we're covering tonight in terms of that. So the blackout is what we'll start off with first. So in terms of the blackout, this is something the scriptures talk about during the end time or end period, and it includes also the last days of the church age, as well as during the tribulation. And so the scriptures speak of about 5 blackouts that will happen during this period. So there's 5 blackouts that the scriptures actually speak about in terms of the period that we are in, and also during the tribulation. But there will only be 1 blackout that will happen before the tribulation in terms of out of these 5 blackouts. And we'll cover more about the other 4 blackouts when we reach the mid-tribulation events, as well as right up until the second coming of the Messiah. But for those of you that may not be, be aware what the definition of a blackout means. Basically, a blackout means that it's the light of the sun or the moon and the stars are suddenly blacked out. So that's what it means. I mean, a lot of us probably familiar with some form of blackout in terms of electricity within a city, for those of you that may have experienced this. But the blackout that the Bible talks about, it means the light coming from the sun, the light coming from the moon, and the light coming from the stars are suddenly blacked out. That what happens is the earth no longer receives any light at all. So none of the light sources that come from the moon, sun, and stars reflect on the earth anymore, and it becomes a total darkness. So this will be similar to the Blackouts of Egypt. For those of us that are familiar with the story of Egypt, which took place during one of the 10 plagues, and that's as described in Exodus. So there's the one in Exodus, and there's the one where Jesus also, when he was in Matthew 27:45, when he was crucified, there was a large blackout that happens there. But let's look at that first example of it, where in Exodus 10:21 and verse 23, where it said, "And Jehovah said unto Moses, Stretch out your hand toward heaven, that there may be darkness over the land of Egypt, even darkness which may be felt. And Moses stretched forth his hand toward heaven, and there was a thick darkness in all the land of Egypt 3 days. They saw not one another, neither rose any one from his place for 3 days. But all the children of Israel had light in their dwellings." The other example there is in Matthew 27:45, and it reads this, "Now from the 6th hour there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour." And so in those two examples there, we see that these particular blackouts have happened before. Now, these aren't just your ordinary blackouts. These are blackouts where some people have described this, or the scriptures have described it as a thickness, especially when you see there's no more sun, no more moon, and also no lights coming off the stars. It's something, it'll be something of an experience, I would say. And in that first example, you see the Israelites were in that situation for 3 days. And then, of course, the Messiah, from the 6th hour, there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. So for a good period there of at least three hours, there was this darkness during that period when Jesus died. But in terms of the end times, in terms of the blackout that we're talking about tonight, the first of these 5 blackouts we see is clearly described in Joel 2, verse 31, where it says, "The sun shall be turned into darkness, and the moon into blood, before the great and terrible day of Jehovah comes." So this is in Joel 2, chapter 2, verse 31. And if you look at that, the sun, the moon, and so we know that this is a blackout, but what's the timing? It says before the great and terrible day of Jehovah. Now, if you remember how, remember the day of Jehovah is always a term used in scriptures when it comes to the tribulation period, or it's that day of Jehovah. So when you see that term, day of Jehovah, just take note that that's what it's referring to. And so that there is what it's talking about, that this particular event, and that's just to, so for us to, when we read our scriptures, helps us to pinpoint a date or a time frame that we know that the day of Jehovah is talking about the future tribulation. That's what it's always referring to. So this event, although it's in the Old Testament in Joel chapter 2, verse 31, it's not talking about an event that would have happened at that time, or even in the Old Testament. It's talking about an event that has to happen before the day of Jehovah comes. So that's the prophecy of Joel. So in terms of that blackout, that's what will happen, and that's what Scriptures tells us, and that's the first pre-tribulation event that will happen at some point. We don't know exactly when, but all we know is that this event will happen at least once before the tribulation. This is 1 out of 5. So, yes, we may be here and that may happen, but whatever it is, it's an event that certainly will bring a bit of eyebrows, I guess, for people if that ever happens. So save up your batteries and or candles when that day decides to come. So that was the first pre-trib event. That's not in a sort of a particular order. And so then we come to the second event that's to happen before the tribulation, and this is called the return of Elijah. The return of Elijah. So this, of course, is another event that's clearly predicted to occur before the tribulation, and it's the return of Elijah. If you can turn to Malachi chapter 4, Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. Behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the great and terrible day of Jehovah come. And he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers, lest I come and smite the earth with the curse. So there in verse 5, it pinpoints, of course, the return of Elijah as coming before the day of Jehovah. So we know that the day of Jehovah is referring to the tribulation. So we know that this event comes before then. And then we see in verse 6 goes on to describe the nature of Elijah's ministry when he returns. And the nature of Elijah's ministry is, in that verse it says there, and he shall turn the heart of the fathers to the children, and the heart of the children to their fathers. So that's referring to a Jewish family reunion program. Remember we were talking about all the gatherings, previously, we were just warming up to what this regathering of Israel, and I guess this is part of that, and it's part of that Jewish family reunion program that God has in store for the lambs that have been scattered in terms of the people of Israel. So I guess in terms of where Elijah's ministry is concerned, it's one of those reasons for him to return, and that's part of his ministry as well. One thing to note is the Jewish family unit have always been strong for so many centuries. It's only really in these last days where it's begun to break down. Excuse me. Where it's begun to break down. And of course, we've also touched on that. According to the prophetic word, it will continue to break down in terms of the family unit. So that's one of the purposes of the ministry where Elijah is concerned, is to restore this unity, and it's in preparation for the second coming of the Messiah. Now, another thing to note is that there's been a lot of confusion between Elijah and John the Baptist. So there's a bit of a confusion there, and it's probably good for us to sort of just explore that a little bit, so then we can become familiar with where, if you've been reading through the New Testament, especially the Life of Messiah series, you'll be able to see there is a confusion between from the disciples of that time being confused between these two characters, and the confusion is around the first coming of Messiah and also the second coming of Messiah. Now, we know that in terms of where John the Baptist is concerned, that that John the Baptist was predicted to be a forerunner. A forerunner but that's only in regards to the first coming of Messiah. That's John Baptist the role. And that's why when you read the passages where some were asking the questions of who John the Baptist was, some of them were confused. Is he Elijah? Because the Old Testament, those passages we just saw earlier with Joel and some of the other passages that we'll look at as well, all refer to someone who will come in the spirit of Elijah. And so that's where this confusion has come upon when John the Baptist appears on the scene. So in Malachi chapter 3 verse 1 predicts that there was going to be a forerunner in the first coming of Messiah, where it says, "Behold, I send my messenger, and he shall prepare the way before me, and the Lord whom you seek will suddenly come to his temple, and the messenger of the covenant whom you desire, behold, he comes, says Jehovah of hosts. And also we look further also to, what's the other verse there? Also in Isaiah 40, verses 3 to 5. The voice of one that cries, prepare ye in the wilderness the way of Jehovah, make level in the desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, and every mountain and hill shall be made low, and the uneven shall be made level, and the rough places a plain. And the glory of Jehovah shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together, for the mouth of Jehovah has spoken it. So we'll go back there as well. So another verse is Matthew 3, chapter 3, verses 1. And that's, so Matthew chapter 3, verses 1 to 6. And so those passages that I've just read, there were prophecies of a forerunner. And that forerunner was fulfilled in Matthew 3, verses 1 to 6. And it's fulfilled in the person that we have here as John the Baptist. So he's the forerunner that Isaiah 40, verse 3 to 5, and Malachi 3:1 is talking about. He was the one that's going to come as a forerunner to proclaim or preach that the coming Messiah is coming. So he's the forerunner in terms of the first coming, in terms of that first coming. So if you read John 1, verse 23, that's who the forerunner was predicted before the first coming. So that's the prediction before the first coming. So John was a type of Elijah in that he came in the spirit and power of Elijah. So the message was that if Israel had accepted the message, then I guess this is a case scenario. If Israel, who heard the message that John the Baptist was talking about, if they had accepted that message, then I guess in reality it would have accomplished the function of those prophecies in terms of Elijah, but that wasn't to be the case, because we know, I guess in hindsight now, that Jesus was rejected. Messiah was, John the Baptist and the Messiah was rejected by the Jewish leaders and also the nation as well. So in that case, Elijah is still to come. Is still to come, in a sense, to perform the work of restoration before the tribulation. And so when you look at it, Elijah will be exactly in the same way as a forerunner for Jesus, but in the second coming. Just as the same as when John the Baptist was a forerunner for Jesus in the first coming, Elijah would be the forerunner in regards to Jesus when he comes back in the second coming. So that's exciting. So this chap, Elijah, will appear any time between now and before the tribulation. How they will work out, we're not quite sure exactly of the time. There's not enough information from scriptures to tell us exactly when. All it tells us is that it will happen before the day of Jehovah. And this is why it's here in this category in terms of other pre-tribulation events. So our man Elijah, in whatever form Elijah will appear, and he'll serve as someone who will regather, I guess, or minister in terms of uniting the Jewish families again. And this is all for preparing the Jewish nation for the second coming. So that's what Elijah will be doing, just as John the Baptist did that in the first coming. Exciting. So that's the second pre-tribulation event. We don't know the timing of, but will happen before the tribulation. The next thing we're going to touch on tonight is the third pre-tribulation event. And really this should have a question mark on it, because the reason why it should have a question mark on it is because there isn't really enough biblical data, or not sufficient in terms of dating exactly when the rebuilding of this temple will begin. It probably may come before the tribulation, but it's not quite certain. But one thing's for sure, as you will see, scriptures do mention this temple in the mid-tribulation period, so it's assuming that it would have already been built by that time when the scriptures are talking about events surrounding this temple, especially around the events during the tribulation and leading up to the mid-tribulation. But there are four passages in scripture that we'll look at which covers the third temple, and the first two there, as you find in Daniel 9, verse 27. And we're already familiar with this passage because we've already read it. And he shall make a firm covenant with many for 1 week, and in the middle of the week he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. And so that sacrifice and oblation to cease is referring to activities that you would do in a temple. And so that's assuming, and so there's a time period, the covenant with many for 1 week, which is 7 days. So that's 7 years. So that's the covenant that the Antichrist will sign. And then in the middle of that week, which is the middle of the tribulation, you'll see that, of course, it appears that the sacrifices and oblations will stop at that point. So that's the assumption that we're seeing there from that passage. Now, the other second passage there is at the bottom there, Matthew 24, verse 15. When therefore you see the abomination of desolation, which was spoken of through Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place, let him that reads understand. So that's the second passage. That abomination of desolation is talking about because you've got to remember a temple is something that's holy. Remember the Jews at this stage, that's a place that they built for God to come in and dwell. And also a lot of the atonement sacrificial stuff is happening there. But here the abomination of desolation is referring to a despicable act of idolatry that happens in there. And obviously the Antichrist sets himself in there. And so that's what's happening here. Now the last two passages which cover the third temple is 2 Thessalonians 2, verses 3 to 4, which mentions the third temple, and it says, "Let no man beguile you in any wise, for it will not be except the falling away come first." And the falling away we know now is church apostasy. "And the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition, he that opposes and exalts himself against all that is called God or that is worshipped, so that he sits in the temple of God, setting himself forth as God." Again, temple of God. And that's referring to the third temple. And then in the fourth passage, it's in Revelation chapter 11, verses 1, 2. And it talks about, "And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and one said, Rise and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein, and the court which is without the temple, leave without, and measure it not, for it has been given unto the nations. And the holy city shall they tread under foot 42 months." So, what all these four passages describe are events. They all describe it to take in the middle of the tribulation, so these particular events. But those details will go into more detail further in chapter 11. But it's enough to say that when we're reading through all of these four passages, these events that these four passages reveal obviously relate to the third temple or the Jewish temple, and these events take place in the middle of the tribulation. The main point is though it's a pre-tribulation event, is the assumption that obviously the temple has already been built by this time, So, especially by the middle of the tribulation. So, the rebuilding of this temple obviously must happen before then. And so it may fall just before the tribulation or may fall just in between there. That's why there should be a question mark on the timing of this third temple. But nonetheless, we can safely say that the third temple will be rebuilt in terms of where Israel will try and rebuild it, because we can see from those passages that obviously it has been rebuilt by that time, before the midway of tribulation anyway. So it does require this temple to be built at that time. That's, I guess, the main point. Now, I just thought and then also to note too, Matthew 11 verses 7 to 10 makes the same point. I'll just read that. And as they went their way, Jesus began to say unto the multitudes concerning John, What went you out into the wilderness to behold? A reed shaken with the wind. But what went you out to see? A man clothed in soft raiment? Behold, they that wear soft raiment are in kings' houses. But wherefore went you out? To see a prophet? Yea, I say unto you, and much more than a prophet. This is he of whom it is written, Behold, I send my messenger before your face, who shall prepare your way for you. And so, so that Matthew passage, of course, is quoting lots of those passages that we've just read in terms from the Old Testament. So that's Matthew there, or Jesus quoting the same thing, making the same points. And that's the same in John 1, verse 23. And in that verse it says, He said, I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord, as said the Isaiah the prophet. So again, so according to Matthew 3 and John 1:23, the prophetic book that's been quoted there is, of course, Isaiah. So while John the Baptist fulfilled those prophecies concerning the forerunner before the first coming of Messiah, of course he was not the Elijah, right? Now, in terms of this temple, I thought it's easier that I just so that some of you that may not be may not be familiar with the temples, but the third temple, there are 4 temples. So I thought I'd put that diagram there just so then for those of us that might be confused on what this temple is. The third temple we're talking about here is the Tribulation Temple. Now, there's 4 in total. The first one, now before the temples were created, just some background there is now there is a good study on its own in terms, it's called the 4 temples of the Bible. And that's it's a good study to do on its own for you to, if you had time to go into that, because that goes into a little bit more detail. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in regards to that study, but I'll just make some notes so then for those of you that aren't familiar with these temples will have some idea of it and help with some understanding to it. But there are 4 temples. But before it got to this temple, remember the Jews, there was the Ark of the Covenant, and it was tents that they formed before they decided to build what we know here as the more solid temples that started off with Solomon. So God dwelled in the tabernacles that was made in a tent form when Israel were nomads and they traveled around the wilderness. So God was always with them, or when he decided to come and visit them, that's where he would dwell, was in the tent or the tabernacle that was tent form. It's only during David's time that he felt guilty that he would live in an actual house while God he perceived that while God is living in a tent. And so it's from there that it transferred into that David's desire is to build a temple, so then God is able to dwell in it. So that's where it came about. But the thing is that David was never going to be put in that place in terms of, from God's point of view, to build the actual temple, because David's hands was, stained with of course, being a king that was involved in war. His hands were stained with the stain of killing people. And so that was inappropriate for him to build a temple in the form that we know now today. But nonetheless, I guess, although David's desire was to build that temple, it wasn't for him to do that. It was his son Solomon that would eventually be given the responsibility to do that. But before Solomon was to build this temple, what we do know is that David at least was given the task of preparing the stuff that was needed to have that temple built. So that's what David did. And you see this recorded in 2 Samuel chapter 7, verses 1 to 17. If you want to do your own reading in that time, you'll see that's the time when David's desire, and he begins to do the plans in order to prepare it for Solomon. So he set up all the stuff. He bought the land. So he bought the land, which was, of course, the Mount Moriah. Mount Moriah. And that's the mountain, of course, is where the temple was to stand, and that's where it is. And that's generally the location area of where it is today. So although David was forbidden to build the house himself, at least he was given. He wasn't stopped from making the preparations for the building, so he did that in that way. But he did it in two ways. First, he bought that land, Mount Moriah, and also he what else did he do? So he bought that land, Moriah. I lost my train of thought there. So Mount Moriah is where he bought that. And then Solomon builds on that later on. And so on that chart that I have there in front of us, the first temple that goes up is Solomon's temple, and number 1, first of the 4 temples. That's from the Old Testament of 2 Chronicles 3:1. And then we know, because we just did the times of Gentiles, So the temple at that point was always under Jewish control, and then it fell when King Nebuchadnezzar comes into power, and we know the Babylonian kingdom takes Israel into captivity, and the temple was burned to the ground and destroyed by King Nebuchadnezzar. So that's the first temple. Solomon's temple was destroyed. Now it's being, when it comes to phase 2, it begins a rebuilding phase. Now the rebuilding phase there, I've just lost my piece of paper. So there's a rebuilding phase there in temple number 2. And Zerubbabel and Herod, we put Herod there. Herod was the ruler at that time, during Jesus' time. Now, of course, Zerubbabel was the one that started it, but what people get confused is that some people say it was Zerubbabel's temple, but the thing you have to remember is that actually especially the second temple, was built in 2 phases. The first phase, of course, was started off by Zerubbabel, and then it was Herod that finished the second part of that temple. So that's, you get some people say it's Herod's temple, and you have some people say Zerubbabel. The answer is that both were involved, and it was just in terms of, it was 2 phases. The first phase was Zerubbabel, who started it off, of course, the building of it, rebuilding of that temple too. and then Herod completed it in terms of that time. So it was completed during Jesus' time. And of course, Jesus predicted when he went through it, he said that this temple will also be burned down in 70 AD, was when that prophecy became fulfilled. So we know the Romans, again, the second temple was destroyed in 70 AD by the Romans. Now, then you come to the third temple there. It's this third temple that we're obviously talking about, and that's called the Tribulation Temple, I guess is the important thing there. Now, there's also a fourth temple that you'll see on that chart, That comes after the tribulation. You're probably wondering, well, why is there a fourth temple? Well, there is a fourth temple in the Millennium Kingdom that also, obviously, there will be sacrifices happening there, but we'll talk more about that later in the other chapters. But just know that that fourth temple will be built during the millennium, during Jesus' time when he reigns for 1,000 years. Now, the key thing to remember, out of all of these four temples, 3 of them were sanctioned by God. In other words, God approved of it. The one that he doesn't approve is the third one. That's a distinction to be made out of the 4 temples. 3 of them, of course, God approved that they should be built, but it's the third one that he doesn't, that he objects to. So this third temple, doesn't get any sanction from God at all. So if we turn to Isaiah 66, verses 1 to 6, Isaiah 66, verse 1 to 6. Now, thus says Jehovah, heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool. What manner of house will you build unto me? And what place shall be my rest? For all these things had my hand made, and so all these things came to be, says Jehovah. But to this man will I look, even to him that is poor and of a contrite spirit, and that trembles at my word. He that kills an ox is he that slays a man. He that sacrifices a lamb is he that breaks a dog's neck. He that offers an oblation is he that offers swine's blood. He that burns frankincense is he that blesses an idol. Yea, they have chosen their own ways, and their soul delights in their abominations. I also will choose their delusions, and will bring their fears upon them. Because when I called, none did answer. When I spoke, they did not hear. But they did that which was evil in my eyes, and chose that wherein I delighted not. Hear the word of Jehovah, he that tremble at his word. Your brethren that hate you, that cast you out for my name's sake, have said, let Jehovah be glorified, that we may see your joy. But it is they that shall be put to shame. A voice of tumult from the city, a voice from the temple, a voice of Jehovah that renders recompense to his enemies. So what we see there, of course, is the passage begins with a protest from God. And we see there that he makes it quite clear that there's no temple built by Israel at this time will ever be acceptable, even though it will be rebuilt. That's what God is saying here. Because God doesn't come and reside in this one as he did in the first temple. He's not going into this one. You see, in verse 2, what God is requiring at this time is not a temple, but faith. So again, that word faith, and that's the purpose, I guess, we just had earlier, where Elijah is going to come in at some point. All of this is all about regathering of Israel to faith. That's probably a key point here. And so this third temple is definitely not sanctioned by God. So he won't accept, so even if it's rebuilt, he's not going to accept any of these reinstituted Levitical sacrifices anymore. Get this, any more than he would accept human sacrifices. Look at verse 3, that's what it's saying. Swine or idolatry in the Old Testament. And the very fact in verse 4 that they will build this temple shows their failure to listen to God's word. And the only thing that you can come to is you have to come to God by faith in Jesus the Messiah. You cannot go, you can't do it this way that they're trying to attempt to do. But then we also see in that passage that Isaiah still has a word of encouragement to those faithful Jews who will not participate, especially the faithful Jews that are in there that aren't going to participate in the rebuilding of this temple, verse 5. But they are seeking to do God's will. So again, as in the Old Testament, there will always be a faithful remnant within Israel. Remember, you'll always hear that term, the remnant. It's always referring to that within Israel there are always true believers. And even though it's within Israel and others that appear that they are following God, but their hearts are far from God because they don't. Yes, they may follow all of the right protocols, but they're not believers. They don't believe or put their faith in the true God. So that's the remnant, is the faithful remnant. They won't participate in this rebuilding of the Jewish temple because they already know God's will, and also they can only please God in faith. And finally, now Isaiah states that this new temple will only end in judgment for them. Now we know that from those passages, we know that obviously halfway through the tribulation, whatever peace treaty or window of peace that were given, it falls short at halfway through this 7-year treaty. And then things will start to go real crazy for them. And in this passage here, it's talking about judgment. And it's in judgment, and it's not in forgiveness of sin or acceptable worship. So anything that they do with this particular third temple that they think, or the Jewish people at this point think, will have them draw nearer to God, will be an absolute failure. Now, there's two other things that I guess should be mentioned that Arnold mentions in this chapter in regards to the third temple. And the first thing is that, remember before, we're reminded that the 6-day war that happened 1967, remember that although the 6-day war is not mentioned in prophecy itself, but it was the action that happened. It's the event that led to the to that temple compound that came under Jewish control. So remember, the events leading in 1967 fulfilled the prophecy that the Jewish city compound will come under Jewish control, and that's what resulted after the 6-day war. And we already covered this in the previous chapter. So what we're seeing is now we're having another issue that will come up too, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, is even though they're going to rebuild this temple, there's going to be an issue currently, for those of you familiar with, is the dome of the rock that's smack right in the middle of the city there, and that will cause some problems if they're going to rebuild this temple. So at least with the 6-day war, because that city area where the old temple is, or parts of it, that 6-day war at least made it possible, or the possibility of this rebuilding of the temple. So in regards to this temple being rebuilt, that does provide that probability or possibility for it to come, and it may happen in the next 30 years, who knows. But there is, because of that event, it's made it possible now. Now that was the first thing. The second thing to note is, in regards to the third temple, is the Tribal Levi. Now, if you're not familiar with this, the Israelites, remember, out of the 12 tribes, there was only the only way that you can become a priest, it had to come from one tribe within the whole of the 12 tribes of Israel, and the priests, or the Aaronic priests, had to come from the tribe of Levi. Couldn't come from any other tribe. So that'll be something that we'll talk about shortly. But that's interesting because you have to be, in order to be, if you're going to rebuild this temple, you also need priests. But those priests can't just be Jewish or anybody from any other line of Jews. They had to prove that their lineage comes from the Tribal Levi, not just because they're Jewish. And so there will be some issues there. So they need somebody who has a descendant of the Tribal Levi in order to be permitted to do any of those Mosaic law or conduct the sacrificial systems that's required in the temple. Another thing to note is that the other 11 tribes, even though they lost their... The problem is, out of the 12 tribes, and I didn't know this, but the other 11 tribes have actually lost all of their tribal identity records since the destruction of the temple in 70 AD. Well, a lot of the Jews kept all of their genealogy records during that within the temple. Unfortunately, in 70 AD, we know that was destroyed. So it destroyed all of the records of all of the Jews, records of their lineages and everything from that point. Now, the only thing is yes, that was for the other 11 tribes, but for the tribe of Levi, this wasn't an issue because they kept it. They kept their own records. The tribe of Levi kept family records. So, in terms of if you want to claim that you're from the tribe of Levi, they knew exactly whether you were lying or not in your genealogy because they kept those records. So, in regards to the possibilities of having maintaining a rebuilding of this temple and having the priests to be able to carry out those activities, at least here we know that the tribe of Levi have kept their identity. Now, names such as Jewish names like Levi, Levi, Livin, Levine, Leventhal, Levinson, Kohens are another name. All of these names, these Jewish names, come from the tribe of Levi. So unless you have a surname like that or any of those names that we mentioned, you'll be able to be, you have a chance to become one of those priests to help conduct those sacrifices during the third temple. So the point is, it's not important to know who the members of the other tribes are, really, at this point. The only thing that's important in terms of this third temple is to know who the Levites are, because that's the key, because we know that the records of the Levites have been kept. So in that way, the stage has been set in terms of this temple to be rebuilt. And so it is possible that this can be rebuilt before the tribulation. Now, if it doesn't come before the tribulation, we know it has to happen before the middle of tribulation, because that's on that timeline there. When we're talking at those passages, is always talking about in the middle when things happen, and that obviously the oblation ceases, all the sacrifices cease when it comes to the middle of tribulation. They can't do any more of those activities in that temple. Now, there's only one, I guess, more one of the issues that's it's going to happen at the moment, and that chart that's in front of us, or that photograph, right in the middle there is what they call the Dome of the Rock. Now, the Dome of the Rock is, at the moment, the Muslims control that part. So on the bottom there is the Western Wailing Wall, which is the remnant. This is the remaining parts of that wall of the temple. So it gives you an idea of the size of the actual temple from the old days. So this is the old city. And currently the old city, apart from that area where the Dome Rock is and the mosque, which is controlled by the Muslims, the old city is under Jewish control. So at the moment, the issue is that if they're going to rebuild this temple, there's something called the Dome of the Rock that's going to be a problem, because that's where the Muslims, at the moment, that's their mosque that they've built right on top of it, the cheeky fellas. So the issue now is that Israel has a that's one of the problems that they have if they're going to rebuild this third temple. So we know that they have to rebuild this temple, but that's the issue that they have to come across. So the question of the Muslim Dome of the Rock, and that's right in that temple area, as you can see. Now there's been some opinions out there that the Arabs may possibly give this back to Jerusalem, and they may just move the Dome of the Rock to a better locality. So that's some reasons that people offered that the Arabs will probably do that. But the problem is that what people don't know is that, well, the point that Arnold makes here that a lot of people miss is that it's not the dome itself that's holy to Islam. Dome itself is not holy to Islam. It's actually the site that's holy to Islam. Because in Muslim tradition, the Dome of the Rock was built over a spot where they say Muhammad ascended into heaven. It's quite a clever trick that Satan has done that. He's done that smack right there. So if that's what they hold, that Muhammad, no different from when Jesus ascended into heaven. If that's so, it's not the Dome of Rock; it's the site itself. So that would be prove to be an issue for itself, in order for any rebuilding to happen. So it's the actual area that's holy to Islam, not the Dome of Rock itself. So I think it would be a little bit foolish to think that the Arabs would consent to moving the Dome of Rock, because it's not just the Dome of Rock that's important, it's the actual location of that site that's holy to them. Now, there's also other points that the Jews may move that site somewhere else and build somewhere else. Or they may move the temple to another area to rebuild it. But the scriptures are pretty clear on that where that temple will be rebuilt would be in this area, not any other area. Because again, just like the Arabs, that area where the Dome of Rock is where the original temple was built. So in terms of where David bought the land, and so I can't see them going around that as well. But the point is that what's happening is that there are lots of things going on now at the moment. There's from a list of things that I see Arnold's is put down here. There's families involved in the Levite tribe that are also at the moment training, in preparation now. They're all preparing for this temple that's going to be rebuilt. It possibly be already started already, but the thing is that the third temple will be rebuilt. The sad thing is that this third temple is not really sanctioned by God. God won't accept it, no matter how passionate they are. I mean, there was a video that Margaret sent through last week, and it was regards to a lot of the Orthodox Jews celebrating. I think they were starting some ceremonies of starting to build that temple. So they're ready to rebuild this temple, but they're ultimately rejecting Jesus outrightly. They don't accept him as God. To them, they think it's sacrilege or idolatry, and so that's what they're preparing for. And that's the third temple. And so those are the three things that in terms of this chapter 5 wanted to talk about, and that was to talk about these other pre-tribulation events that Bible's not clear when they will happen, just that they will happen. Now, of course, there's the fourth one, which is the rapture, and we'll cover that more in detail in chapter 6, which will start on Wednesday. So that's a nice short Bible study for tonight, and that finishes our chapter 5. And so gives us a chance to also go back through our notes again, go through especially the last chapter. Really, this chapter 5 is really just a little extension of that as well. But they'll give us some time to go through our notes, meditate on it, read the passages that have been given, go through your study notes, and then um, hopefully we can get up to date, as we go from week to week.